The Atlantic Ocean, in the year 1715, was a vast and open graveyard. A wooden ship, perhaps 70 feet long, pitched on the cold swell, its sails straining against a grey sky. Below decks, 47 men lived in a space designed for half that number. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale seawater, and the faint metallic hint of old blood soaked into the floorboards. Every man aboard knew the statistics, not from a book, but from bitter experience. The average pirate in this era could expect to live only 2 to 3 more years. Some would die within months. A very few might survive a decade. Almost none would live to see the age of 30. This was the dark reality of life expectancy on a pirate ship. It was not decided by epic sea battles or dramatic mutinies, but by a slow, grinding attrition of mundane horrors. The primary threat was not enemy cannons, but the vessel itself. A pirate ship was usually a captured merchant vessel, retrofitted for speed and firepower. The crew lived on the gun deck, a low-ceilinged space crammed with cannons, crates, and the men's worldly possessions. They slept in hammocks slung so close together that a man could reach out and touch his neighbor. There was no privacy and little fresh air. Seawater constantly seeped through the hull, mixing with spilled rum, urine, and food waste, to create a permanent, foul-smelling sludge underfoot. Men spent months walking on this perpetually damp wood. Their leather shoes rotted. Their feet grew pale, soft, and painfully swollen, a condition later called trench foot, though pirates simply called it the rot. It was a slow, debilitating injury that made every step an agony and left men vulnerable to worse infections. Their diet actively worked against their health. The main staple was hardtack, a rock-hard biscuit baked to last for years. It was so dense men sometimes broke teeth on it. More often, the biscuits were alive with weevils and maggots. Sailors developed a routine of tapping each piece on the table to dislodge the insects before eating. When the infestation was too severe, they ate the weevils for the protein. The meat was salted beef, or pork, preserved in barrels of brine. The curing process leached all moisture and flavor, leaving behind a leathery, stringy substance that tasted only of salt. The drinking water, stored in wooden casks for months, grew a slimy green biofilm and often hosted worms. This combination of malnutrition and contaminated water led to chronic dysentery, a debilitating flux that left men weak, dehydrated, and chained to the ship's heads. Medical care was rudimentary to the point of being often worse than the disease. The ship's surgeon, if one was aboard, possessed a terrifyingly simple kit: a bone saw, amputation knives, forceps, needles, and thread. His pharmacy consisted of rum for anesthesia, vinegar for cleaning wounds, and a small stock of herbs, like opium for pain or cinchona bark for fever. He had no understanding of germs or sterilization. When a crewman showed the telltale signs of scurvy, lethargy, swollen gums, teeth loosening in their sockets, the surgeon knew citrus might help, but such fresh provisions were almost never available on a long voyage. He could only administer a useless tonic and watch the man deteriorate. For a deep wound, the surgeon faced a grim calculus: attempt to save the limb and risk a fatal infection, or amputate immediately and subject the man to the shock and blood loss of surgery without proper antiseptics. Either path frequently ended at the same point: a weighted shroud and a splash over the rail. Despite these horrific conditions, men voluntarily signed the pirate articles. The reason was a cold economic calculus. A common sailor in the British Navy or on a merchant vessel faced similarly brutal conditions, but for a pittance in pay that was often withheld. A pirate, by contrast, operated under a democratic contract where the crew voted on targets, shared the plunder equally, and received compensation for injuries. A single successful capture could net a pirate more money than a decade of honest sailors' wages. For many, the tremendous risk was a rational trade for the chance, however slim, at a life-changing sum. They were not blind to the odds. They simply valued a few years of agency and potential wealth over a long lifetime of impoverished, brutalized obedience. Their short life expectancy was the price of that desperate lottery ticket. The sea, the ship, and their own bodies were the house, and the house always won. The day began before dawn. not with a gentle wake-up call but with the creaking of the hull and the cold spray of seawater. On a pirate ship in the early 18th century, there was no such thing as a comfortable morning. The crew slept wherever they could find space, often in the damp darkness between decks where the ceiling was so low a man could not sit upright. Hammocks swung close together, sometimes touching, and the air was thick with the smell of sweat, wood rot, and stale bilge water. A crew of 80 to 100 men lived in a space designed for perhaps half that number. Personal space was a concept that did not exist. Food was a constant source of misery. The staple was hardtack, a biscuit baked so dry it could last for months, but it often became infested with weevils. Sailors would tap the biscuit on the table to knock the insects out before eating, or they would simply eat them along with the bread, accepting the extra protein as part of the ration. Salted beef and pork were the main sources of meat, preserved in barrels of brine. After months at sea, the meat became rock hard and had to be soaked for hours before it could be chewed. The taste was often rancid, and the texture was like leather. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare luxuries, and their absence led to scurvy, a disease that caused gums to bleed, teeth to fall out, and old wounds to reopen. A pirate who survived a battle might later die from a simple cut that refused to heal because his body had run out of vitamin C. Water was even more precious than food. The ship carried barrels of fresh water, but it turned stagnant and green within weeks. Men drank it anyway, mixing it with rum to mask the taste. Alcohol was safer than water because the fermentation process killed many bacteria, so beer and wine were common on board. But alcohol brought its own problems. A drunken crew was a slow crew, and a slow crew was a dead crew. Discipline had to be strict, even on a pirate ship where the men had elected their captain. The Articles of Agreement, signed by every crew member, spelled out the punishments for theft, cowardice, and disobedience. A man who stole from another might be marooned on a deserted island with nothing but a pistol and a bottle of powder. A man who deserted his post in battle could lose his nose or his ears. Flogging was common, and the cat o' nine tails left permanent scars on a man's back. Healthcare was almost non-existent. The ship might carry a surgeon, but his training was often minimal, and his tools were crude. Amputation was the standard treatment for a broken limb, performed without anesthesia. The patient bit down on a leather strap while the surgeon sawed through bone. Infection was the leading cause of death after battle. A wound that did not kill immediately could fester and turn gangrenous within days. The surgeon would then have to cut off the limb, hoping the patient survived the shock and blood loss. Most did not. Disease spread quickly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, typhus, and yellow fever swept through crews with terrifying speed. A man who fell ill was often left to die because the ship had no room for the sick and no medicine to treat them. The close quarters meant that privacy was impossible. Men ate, slept, and worked within inches of each other. The smell was overwhelming. Bodies went unwashed for weeks, clothes were never changed, and the ship itself was a floating sewer. Rats infested the hold, carrying fleas that spread disease. The wooden decks were scrubbed with sand and vinegar, but the smell of rot never fully disappeared. A pirate ship was not a place of adventure and freedom. It was a cramped, stinking, dangerous box where men lived on the edge of death every single day. The average life expectancy for a pirate who survived his first voyage was still under 30 years. Most died not in glorious battle but from infection, starvation, or the slow decay of a body pushed past its limits. The dark reality of life expectancy on a pirate ship. Life as a pirate was a perpetual balancing act, where the spectre of death loomed large, casting a long shadow over every waking moment. The ever-present threat of violence, disease, and accidents created an atmosphere of palpable tension, where a misstep could prove fatal. A sailor working aloft in heavy weather might lose his grip and plummet 40 feet onto the deck, suffering severe injuries that would likely become infected within days, given the lack of proper medical care. The sound of shattering wood and the anguished cries of the fallen man would echo through the ship, a grim reminder of the dangers that lurked in every task. A stark illustration of the dark reality of life expectancy on a pirate ship. This constant proximity to death took a profound psychological toll on pirates, shaping their behavior in striking ways. They lived with the knowledge that Any day could be their last, and this awareness informed their actions, as they spent their shares quickly, often within days of receiving them. The notion of saving for a future that might never come seemed futile, a sentiment succinctly captured by the grizzled pirate who would say, "Why save for tomorrow when you might not see the dawn?" As he tossed a coin to a tavern wench, his actions a testament to the rational response to a life where planning for next year was a luxury few could afford. Pirates developed various coping mechanisms to deal with the constant threat of death, adopting fatalistic philosophies, superstitions, and escapist behaviors. Many turned to drink as a means of escape, with rum being cheap, plentiful, and potent enough to blur the edges of fear. A man who drank himself unconscious did not have to think about the diseases that would kill him or the shipmates who had died the previous week. The smell of rum and sweat would hang heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the pirate's attempt to escape his mortality, a poignant illustration of the human psyche's capacity for self-deception. The psychological weight of this existence was crushing, as pirates watched their friends die from diseases with no name and no treatment. They saw captains executed by naval authorities, their bodies left hanging in gibbets as warnings, a stark reminder of the price of piracy. This knowledge made pirates calculating, taking risks because the alternative was a slow death from disease or starvation on land. The sea offered a chance, however slim, of wealth and freedom, a siren's call that beckoned them to the unknown, a reality that was both alluring and terrifying. Some pirates formed deep bonds with their crewmates, creating a system of mutual support through the articles they signed. If a man lost a limb in battle, he received compensation from the common fund. If he died, his share went to his designated heir. These arrangements provided a measure of security in a world that offered none, a fragile safety net that protected them from the abyss of uncertainty. Others turned to religion, carrying Bibles and praying before battle, not because they believed God approved of their actions, but because they needed something to hold on to when the guns began to fire, a desperate attempt to find meaning in a seemingly meaningless world. The psychological impact of this constant proximity to death was profound, as pirates developed a particular kind of fatalism that outsiders found difficult to understand. They laughed at dangers that would terrify others, and spent their money on drink and women because they had seen too many men save for a future that never arrived. A pirate who survived long enough to retire was a statistical anomaly, someone who had beaten odds that most people could not even calculate, a living testament to the human spirit's capacity for resilience and adaptability. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the pirate's life became a never-ending cycle of violence, disease, and death. The sound of cannons firing, the smell of gunpowder, and the sight of blood-soaked decks became an all-too-familiar reality, a grim reminder of the dark reality of life expectancy on a pirate ship. And yet, despite the dangers, despite the hardships, the pirate's life was also a life of freedom, a life of adventure, a life of possibility, a reality that was both captivating and terrifying. In this world of contrasts, where life and death walked hand in hand, the pirate's existence was a complex tapestry of emotions, a delicate balance of fear and courage, of despair and hope. It was a life that was both beautiful and brutal, a life that was both captivating and terrifying, a reality that was both alluring and repulsive. And it was this reality, this dark reality of life expectancy on a pirate ship, that defined the pirate's existence, a reality that was both his greatest enemy and his most enduring legacy. The life of a pirate during the Golden Age, spanning roughly from 1650 to 1720, was not an epic adventure, but a grim statistical probability. The average pirate's career lasted less than 2 years. This short span was not a result of early retirement, but of death. The romantic image of treasure chests and parrots stands in stark contrast to the primary cargo of a pirate vessel: disease, desperation, and decay. The reality was a life of extreme physical hardship. A pirate's daily existence was defined by the punishing manual labor required to operate a wooden ship in all weather. He would haul on wet, salt-stiffened ropes until his hands bled. He would climb the rigging during a gale, with the deck pitching violently 100 feet below, to furl sails lashed by wind and rain. Sleep was taken in a cramped, foul-smelling space shared with dozens of other men, where the constant damp-bred mold and the bilge water below emitted a noxious miasma. The food was meager and often rotten, the water slimy and alive with worms. These were not occasional hardships, but the unrelenting baseline of existence. Violence was the most direct and dramatic end, but it was not the most common killer. Naval battles or engagements with well-armed merchantmen were risky endeavors pirates often avoided. When fights did occur, they were brutal and close quarters. A musket ball to the gut meant a slow, agonizing death from infection over days. A cutlass slash could sever a limb, leading to fatal blood loss or gangrene. Many pirates bore the scars of such encounters, missing eyes, fingers, or limbs, living testament to their narrow escapes. More feared than the King's Navy, however, was the judicial system on land. Capture meant almost certain execution. The spectacle of a public hanging at Execution Dock in London or in a colonial port was designed as a grim deterrent. The bodies were often left to rot in iron cages called gibbets, displayed at the mouth of the Thames for years as a warning to all sailors. Yet disease was the silent, pervasive reaper that claimed more lives than any cannon or court. Scurvy, resulting from a profound lack of vitamin C, was the scourge of all sailors, pirates included. It began with lethargy and sore limbs, progressed to swollen, bleeding gums and the reopening of old wounds, and ended in death from hemorrhage or infection. Typhus, known as ship fever, spread rapidly through the crowded, louse-infested quarters below deck, bringing high fever, delirium, and rash. Yellow fever or malaria could decimate a crew that ventured into the Caribbean. The ship's surgeon, if one was even aboard, possessed only crude tools and limited knowledge. Amputation was a common cure for a wounded limb, performed with a saw and a shot of rum, with survival far from guaranteed. A simple splinter wound from working the ship could fester and kill. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. Pirates lived with the constant awareness of their own mortality. This pressure forged a unique social contract. The pirate articles, signed by every crew member, were not mere suggestions but a foundational constitution. They guaranteed a fair share of plunder, compensation for injuries, so much gold for a lost eye or a severed hand, and a form of democratic governance where the captain could be voted out. This system provided a crucial, if fragile, sense of order and justice in a lawless world. The camaraderie born of shared peril was a necessary psychological bulwark. A pirate's loyalty was to his messmates and his ship, for they were his only family and his only chance of survival. The romanticized pirate of later fiction is a distillation of a few appealing truths extracted from a sea of suffering. The allure of freedom from the rigid, often abusive hierarchy of the merchant marine or the Royal Navy was real. The promise of plunder, however fleeting, offered a chance, however slim, to escape a life of poverty. Yet this freedom came at the ultimate price. To choose piracy was to knowingly trade a long, subservient life for a short, autonomous one. The lesson from their experience is not one of glamour, but of stark human calculus. It reveals what people will endure and what rules they will create when faced with a world of limited options and pervasive danger. Their story is ultimately one of adaptation to extreme circumstances, a demonstration of how community and a crude form of equity can emerge even in the darkest of realities. The pirate's life was not a choice for adventure, but a grim gamble where the house always won, and the final cost was measured in years never lived.